All right, welcome to the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. So, inaugural episode of the podcast today. We're going to be talking about, primarily on this channel, military history, war studies, and things like that are a huge passion of mine. And also martial arts and what I would call the personal combat and the individual combative level of things. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today, to get started, is like all males in their mid-30s, I am completely obsessed with studying World War II, and World War I is a huge passion of mine as well. So to kind of get started, I've been sort of trying to put this podcast together for a while, but I can never pick a good place to start a history podcast, because every time you want to talk about something, you also need to go back in time for 200 years to talk about all the things that led to that. So I could never pick a place that I wanted to start. And so I finally just decided on a topic, and what we're going to talk about today are some of the strategic choices of the German military in World War II, and the positive things that it gave them. I'm not going to really discuss whether the positives outweighed the negatives or anything like that, but just to kind of start by, as opposed to just dealing with people's very baseline surface level understanding of the Germans invaded Norway or the Germans invaded Denmark or whatever, let's talk about what they actually got from, certain campaigns, certain countries that they went into. So, we're going to kind of start this a little bit by, we'll deal with it by subject as opposed to just country, because I'm going to have to bounce around a little bit just by the nature of it. So the first subject that we're going to talk about is going to be what is probably the most wide-ranging as far as geographically, is going to be things for the U-boats and the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. So, as you guys kind of might be familiar with, so one of the fundamental issues that the German Navy and what was called the Kriegsmarine in World War II, one of the fundamental problems they had in World War I was, because the British had by far the largest navy around, they're basically able to keep the German Navy bottled up in the Baltic, and they only fought one major engagement, the Battle of Jutland around Denmark there. And so for the most part, the Germans were completely reliant on their U-boat fleet to do damage, which they actually sunk more Allied shipping, what would have been, the Entente, not the Allies in World War I, for a loss of fewer total U-boats in World War I than World War II. But they were very much confined to their own bases until they had taken over some of the ports and some of the sea access in the Low Countries, Denmark, the Netherlands and Belgium and things, and Holland. And so in World War II, this was something that they were all too aware of, which was that they could not allow themselves to be cut off from all of their outside supply and support and things that they would need. So beginning with their campaigns, which kind of started, in 1938, with the Anschluss and the annexation of, the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at the time. So the Germans invade Denmark. They invade Norway in 1940. So for people who are, roughly familiar with Norway has, I don't have the numbers to back this up, but it has one of the, if not the largest, concentrations of relevant and of effective sea ports relative to its total surface area as far as country size of any country in the world. The natural fjords and things, which are very well protected, they give access to the North Atlantic. And so people who are familiar with substantial parts of World War II and the Arctic convoys and the way that the Allies were delivering Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, i.e. going north and around the Scandinavian countries, coming all the way, on the other side of Finland and things to, Murmansk on, I guess, as we kind of think of it as Americans, on sort of the backside of that, but in the very far north of the Soviet Union there. So they established U-boat pens and U-boat bases at Trondheim, Narvik, and Bergen. If I mispronounce any of those, I don't speak any any Norwegian. So this gave them extremely good access to all of the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, and very easy access to Iceland and even parts of what would be northern Scotland, and access to get to places like Scapa Flow and things like that. without being bottled up. And tons and tons of fjords. That's actually where where the battleship Tirpitz was sunk, was being repaired in one of the fjords there. And it was basically being based out of Norway in order to attempt to interdict these large Arctic convoys that were going there. So we're talking. So we've got our three primary bases in Norway. As we move down then into France. So France was probably the single largest concentration of the U-boat bases outside of Germany itself. And so we look at the Bay of Biscay. So the Bay of Biscay would be in like far western France, so kind of like south of Brittany there. And so you're looking at kind of classic, like all of the pictures of the huge sub pens, with the 30-foot concrete roofs that were never penetrated by any of the blockbuster tall boy bombs that the RAF and the United States Army Air Force dropped on them. So you've got Brest, you've got Saint-Nazaire, and I don't speak any French, so if I butcher the French pronunciations, suck it up. I don't really like France anyway. So you've got Brest and Saint-Nazaire, you've got Bordeaux, you have La Rochelle, La Palisse, and then when you get into the Mediterranean, Toulon had U-boat pens, and this was hugely important because, as I said, this gave immediate access to the Atlantic Ocean itself. Whereas if you think about, like Holland and the Netherlands and Belgium and northern France, and even the parts of like northwestern Germany, these kind of open to the English Channel and to the North Sea, but places that are like more easily closed down than than the obviously the wider ocean itself. So by having all of these U-boat pens, these sub bases on the Bay of Biscay and on the Atlantic, on the far west coast of France, they basically have access to immediately get into the Atlantic Ocean proper and launch their operations against the Allied shipping. And this was one of the major reasons that early on in the war, in 40, 41, and part of 42, they were able to be very, very generally successful. Obviously, these things, these things kind of definitely went away, and the tide had changed significantly by 42, 43 when the Battle of the Atlantic had been won. But very important as far as the U-boat bases go, and then also their some of their corresponding support vehicles and stuff like that. So kind of move into the aircraft and things for the Luftwaffe. So obviously the German Air Force, the air arm of the Wehrmacht, and so obviously invading the Low Countries, so Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands, multiple bases that they're able to put there, which gives them easy access to have the range to fly to the Great Britain and to be able to attack the actual home isles there, but also to be able to patrol and interdict things in the Channel. So obviously the Channel is a very major route that has to be navigating controlled at this point of the war, because if you're Britain and early in the war, when you need to get the British Expeditionary Force to France and be able to fight, and then when things go absolutely terribly during Fall Gelb and Fall Rot in the spring and early summer of 1940, now you're at Dunkirk and you need to be able to get those people back. And so the Channel is kind of a lifeline to all of that. So also moving into France is a humongous center of operations for Luftwaffe. So not only the aircraft themselves, but also large portions of what would basically be what you call like the Reichswehr and their defensive network, their defensive system that they used in the West, and things that you associate with like the Kammhuber line, which was the defensive. The defensive setup or system, might be the better word, that they used, especially to control night fighters in defense of the Reich in, sort of the early to middle parts of, the large strategic air campaign against them. So having the ability to have their radar stations, to have their listening stations, to have their searchlights, anti-aircraft batteries, and then their command and control in France and, in the Low Countries and things, allowed them to scramble their fighters and to direct them on earlier to get a better track of where they might actually be going so they could be more effectively dealt with. But also, to try to interdict them before they actually get over German territory itself. Same thing with Norway. Multiple air bases in Norway that were used extensively in the Battle of Britain and used extensively to, patrol the North Sea. Obviously the British are incredibly active with their naval campaigns out there as well, because as much as the Germans are trying to interdict the convoys and the general supply and disposition, the British are basically trying to do the opposite of that. They're also trying to destroy German naval assets and things like that, because at this point the Germans do have a fair amount of battle cruisers and so-called pocket battleships, such as the Tirpitz, the Bismarck, the Admiral Graf Spee, vessels that could potentially, if unleashed out into the Atlantic Ocean proper, could cause a lot of problems for the Atlantic convoys and just the other naval operations. So the British are very active around there, obviously trying to detect when these ships are coming into or leaving these harbors and ports, because you have to also remember at this time that radar and other tracking things, while they advanced very quickly and the British were at the forefront of kind of radar technology for most of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean is humongous and the North Sea is humongous. And so once these ships get out of port, kind of get into the ocean proper, even if you're able to sort of track them or get a fix on them, unless you can actually just stay with it and shadow it, they're probably going to get away. They're very difficult to just keep track of, basically, ad nauseum. So very important, air bases, Belgium and the Low Countries, Belgium, Holland, Netherlands, France, Norway, and Denmark as well in there. Then also we get down into, I guess you can't really say, but, Italy, the Germans have substantial air assets in and around Italy at, in the early parts of the war prior to, when the Allies landed in Italy in force in 1943. And then, the same can also be said for, while these weren't the reasons for the campaigns, same thing can be said for the various Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and things like that. Being able to base their, especially their, tactical bombers and things, and their fighter arm closer to the front, which allowed for, better cohesion and more unit effectiveness, when they actually do invade the Soviet Union in 1941. So kind of covering the air arm there. So now we can talk a little bit about industry as well. So the Germans taking over, annexing, Czechoslovakia in 1938. There's multiple reasons for it. One, substantial parts of Czechoslovakia are historically Germanic, Bohemia, Moravia. So this is not to get into should all ethnic Germans, is it only right, not to get into that conversation. However, there's a lot of, people who felt perfectly justified in annexing Czechoslovakia on both sides, without question. Another substantial reason why Czechoslovakia was very important is Czechoslovakia has at the time they had the Skoda works. So Skoda is still a major vehicle manufacturer in Europe. But at the time, Skoda was a major manufacturer of vehicles and various artillery pieces. They, if you look up a list of the different artillery pieces that the Skoda works made, it's like dozens long. They're especially known for things like mountain howitzers and stuff like that, large caliber artillery pieces that were otherwise, not in and of themselves humongous pieces. The thing that Skoda works is by far the best known for at this time would have been the Panzer 38T. And so the 38T was a light tank, and for the time that it came out and for the first couple years of the war, it was as good as anything around. It fit the bill as far as what operations were at the time. Obviously, tanks would surpass it as it went on, but capturing the Skoda works was absolutely humongous for the Germans, because one, they captured a lot of vehicles themselves, but they captured a factory that was already set to make all of these hulls. And so they were able to use things like the Panzer 38T to make things like the Marder 3, which the Marder 3 was a tank destroyer. People who have watched Saving Private Ryan, I don't know if it's meant to be a Marder 3, but basically the two Panzer tanks in the final battle in that movie are meant to represent Marder tank destroyers. There was Marders 1, 2, and 3, And they're called 1, 2, and 3 based off of the vehicle chassis that they were built on. And I don't honestly remember which was which. I remember the Marder 3 is the Panzer 38T, but it had a high-velocity 75mm gun on top. Very effective, open-top tank destroyers that were used right up through the very end of the war. And then the Panzer 38, which is, now in kind of common parlance, we call that the Hetzer. They didn't call it the Hetzer at the time, but the Hetzer was a very well-liked tank destroyer, and in its time was used right up to the end of the war, used after the war in multiple countries, because it was very, very small, very, it had a gun that was effective enough, and it's one of those for all of its lack of comfort and things like that. It's a small vehicle. It could easily ambush stuff, and it kind of hit above its weight as far as effectiveness goes on that. And the fact that the factory was set up to make those vehicles. And so you have to think about how big of a deal that is. So you have a factory that already has all of the machining, it has all of the winches, it has a fair amount of just the materials and things itself, which also means it has some amount of logistics set up to have rail connections to be able to get things to it and to get vehicles away from there. So it's something that I think we kind of lose sight of in the modern realm, especially in America, because we have so many, the roads comparatively are so good. We have so much rail stuff. Factories are kind of everywhere, but you forget that, especially in a wartime footing, is if it takes you a year or two to build a factory and get it totally online, we don't think anything of that today. But if you're the Germans and you invade Poland in 1939, 2 years represents basically a third of the entire Second World War that you're talking about. So that would be a humongous amount of time, trying to take that on. We can kind of pivot away from Czechoslovakia. We can sort of pivot back to Norway again. So we talked about Norway with the U-boat pens, and we talked about Norway with the airfields. Now, one of the other reasons why Norway was incredibly important, which basically goes back to the naval side of things, is that a large portion, possibly even the majority of the iron ore that the Germans received and used during World War II came from Sweden. Sweden was neutral, in air quotes, so they basically shifted and transported their iron ore to Norway, and then Norway transported it, or the Germans transported it from Norway, down to Germany proper. So this was one of the reasons why, the port of Narvik, for example, was an important port. Why the Germans took it over, using the U-boat pens. It's also why the British launched a commando raid there to destroy, various machinery and oil tanks and things like that. So, very important as far as that goes. Now, this wasn't an initial reason, but we could kind of pivot and also talk about the Ukraine in the same way. So obviously, we're all roughly familiar with the idea that, the Germans were looking for Lebensraum, so living space to eject or kill or otherwise remove Slavic peoples and have a place for Germanic peoples to propagate and to live. So, so obviously that was the purpose of the war. So invading Ukraine was always going to be a part of that, because at this point it's, part of the Soviet Union. But when we look at Ukraine and what it provides for the Soviet Union, a couple of very important things. So one, Ukraine is known as, they call that Black Earth Russia. It's known as the breadbasket of Russia, of the Soviet Union. So a large amount, the lion's share of grain at this time and, other, food related products come from the Ukraine. So obviously they need that for the war effort. Ukraine also sits on the Black Sea, and so we all know about the Crimean Peninsula, the Kerch Peninsula, Sevastopol, the naval base. So the Ukraine occupies the only open water, warm water port that the Soviets have at this time. And what that means is that, so Russia is geographically a humongous country, but it only has a couple of places that you could actually really use for substantial naval presence. So you have the Baltic, centered around Leningrad at the time, St. Petersburg now, kind of in the Gulf of Finland there. You have Murmansk and basically, the north part of Russia. On the far east, you have Port Arthur and all those places over there. And then you have the Black Sea and Sevastopol. So the reason this is obviously incredibly important, strategically, from that is, one, the being able to deny the Soviets the ability to maneuver across the Black Sea. So if you study, in 1941 and 1942, the operations against Sevastopol, and then when the 11th Army under von Manstein finally, captured it in 1942, the Soviets were able to resupply men and material and things like that to the Crimean Peninsula, like with a naval presence all the way through that. So without taking that, technically speaking, there was nothing to stop the Soviets from being able to move all the way across the Black Sea to, Bulgaria, Romania, stuff like that, but also just to be able to, as the Germans pushed further and further, south and east and down towards the Caucasus and stuff like that, technically speaking, without having control of the Crimean Peninsula, of Sevastopol Naval Base and the Kerch Peninsula, there'd be nothing to stop the Soviets from being able to launch continual raids across this area. Another thing that the Ukraine is very well known for is it's the Donetsk Basin, or what's called the Donbass. So, which, if you guys watch the news, like, that's been a point of contention ever since the Russians reinvaded / peacefully, in air quotes, occupied the Crimean Peninsula again, or Sevastopol, in recent history here. And so, very huge source of coal and other minerals. And, at the time in World War II, I haven't really been able to back this up. However, this was what was, again, air quotes, but this was known or believed by the Germans at the time, is that the coal that was available in the Donetsk Basin was the only natural, or the only, the only clandestine sources of coking coal that the Soviet Union had. And so coking coal, I had to do extra research to make sure I try to say the right words on this, but basically, like, coking coal is the stuff that you use in, like, high output blast furnaces for making steel. And basically, there is no method of making large amounts of high quality steel that does not involve coking coal. So if you want to make a bunch of tanks, you want to make a bunch of artillery pieces, things like that, you have to have large amounts of coking coal to make that happen. So the Germans invading Ukraine, one, they have access to this themselves, but also that means that they can deny the access to the Soviets themselves. And if you actually look at Russian production of heavy artillery and things like that, it definitely supports that this was true. As far as being able to control that, what the Germans didn't know at the time, they definitely eventually knew it, was just how much the United States and Great Britain was able to supply to the Soviets via the Atlantic Convoy system and Lend-Lease, which basically made up for any of these things that were going on themselves, as far as denying access to their own locally sourced coking coal and things like that. So, so invading the Ukraine for the, to cut off the food supplies of coking coal to access the Crimean Peninsula and Sevastopol. So, continue to talk about industry. So same thing as we move into, same thing basically as we move into France. And I don't know the specific armories and things like that in France, just because it's much more complex with how much industry France had set up at the time. And France was kind of a different duck compared to the other ones, because, like, what a lot of people kind of don't know or don't really realize is that, so after the Germans took over France, prior to the latter stages of World War II, half of France, Vichy France, ran itself, and the Germans basically weren't there. I mean, they were there, but, like, it wasn't like the Germans were running, like, constant patrols around the Mediterranean areas of France and stuff like that. It's just not what it was, because that was all Vichy France. So the parts of France that turned coat and sided with the Vichy government that sided with the Germans on that. And so the northern parts of France were the ones that the Germans maintained exclusive control over from the get-go there. And obviously that has to do with their air bases and the things they're using for operations against the British home isles, and then being able to control their access to the sea for their U-boat and naval ops, their S-boats, their Schnellboots, E-boats, and things like that. So we can kind of we could do, a couple more positional ones that encompasses the, sort of the basics of what I wanted to talk about today. So we kind of get into, we can get into like, Crete and Malta, which are in the Mediterranean. So I highly recommend, and I do this at work sometimes, one, because I'm, a weirdo like that, but I really like to just look at like a map all the time and try to get an association for where things are at. So when you actually look at a map of the Mediterranean, and you kind of start to realize, like, one, like just how close like Sicily is to North Africa. And, so I mean, the Mediterranean is obviously like a huge body of water, but like the relative distances there are somewhat small. And then you talk about like the Isle of Malta. So being able to have, operations, being able to base operations out of a place like Malta or, Crete in the further east, closer to the Aegean, is like basically, you kind of create this like, void that things have to go around, because now if you have air assets there and naval assets there, now they can range out of there, a certain distance, whatever it may be, and one, they can interdict, they can obviously, attack and otherwise cause damage. But to kind of go back to things that I had talked about before, with radar and being able to track vessels, is so now, now you imagine that you are, that you're operating ships in this area, and you leave from the Eastern Mediterranean, and you're heading back towards the west, and whether you're going south, whether you're going north, doesn't matter. But you have Crete, and so now you have these elements that can send out air assets, naval assets to help track you. So now, the Italian Navy early in the war was it was a very large navy. It turned out they had no radar and were completely ineffective, but on paper, a very potentially dangerous adversary. So being able to help, not only attack, but help track that. And then you look at where Malta sits. So Malta, like, basically splits the distance between the southern part of Sicily and the northern part of, Tunisia, however you say that, exactly in half. So if, so an enemy vessel or vessels that are trying to go from the east part of the Mediterranean to the west, maybe they're trying to get into the Atlantic, so they're going through the Straits of Gibraltar, to get back to the Atlantic. So you have to pass through, through the area south of Sicily. So basically between Sicily and North Africa, and Malta basically splits those exactly in half. So if you have elements, on Malta, and you're basically like, hey guys, there's a bunch of British vessels that just went south of us. Well, okay, now they're already getting funneled down into this area that's only, it's only something like, 75 miles, I think, between, Sicily and the very tip of, Tunisia there. Now you can, you can kind of like, cut that down even further, because now you go, okay, so these vessels all passed south of Malta. So now they're going to have to be in this area as they get funneled down. And so being able to narrow that down, because 75 miles, if you're doing a search pattern or whatever, is still a large amount of space. Don't get me wrong. But, now you can funnel that down, even further. And so that's a very big deal as far as being able to, control territory. And that's why, historically speaking, Malta was always, a major point of contention for the, the various Ottoman wars and, the Knights of St. John and their, famous battles there, and all that. But that encompasses basically the basics of what I kind of wanted to get my channel started with. So, again, kind of quick recap. So, the major reasons for some of the places that the Germans invaded. So for France, you have multiple U-boat bases, being able to get them access to the Atlantic Ocean proper, as well as air bases and other such industry, and then just also access to, the general the general supply disposition of a place like France. Same thing with Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands. Denmark as well, so no real sub bases, naval bases there, but air assets, and also the control of that portion where the North Sea enters into the Baltic Sea, and being able to control the Jutland area. Norway, you have multiple U-boat bases, multiple air bases. You get immediate access to the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea, immediately into the shipping lanes that we're using for the convoys going to the Soviet Union. Also a major point of shipping of the iron ore from Sweden into Norway, from Norway down into Germany. Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic now. The Skoda Works and other such factories. So again, the Skoda Works making what was a very popular, very reliable, very easily modifiable, very versatile machine in the Panzer 38, the Panzer 38T, that became the Marder 3 and the Jagdpanzer 38. So the tank destroyer 38 on that. And then we talked a little bit about, Ukraine and, control of the food supplies, the Donbass and the coking coal and the coal supplies. Also talked about the Crimean Peninsula, the Kerch Peninsula, Sevastopol, the naval bases there. You also have to remember, at the time, different than World War I. So, Romania was allied, with the Germans for the initial part of the invasion into the Soviet Union, things like that. So the control of that area wasn't quite as big a deal as it was, specifically for the Turks in World War I. We talked a little bit about Crete and Malta, and I guess for that matter, Sicily as well. So having air bases in Sicily, was big for the Germans. It was also one of the major reasons why the Allies, conversely attacked Sicily first, was they could use North African bases, air bases, to cover their operations in Sicily. Then once they got into Sicily, they could leapfrog forward, to cover operations in Italy. The Germans doing the same thing, vice versa. But that's all that I want to talk about for the initial Bastion Black Performance podcast. And remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.